There's a relatively low level of familiarity with the provisions in the Employment Relations Act. So less than half of all workers understand what the Act gives them and you know, that they have a right to apply for flexible work. So there's a lot more that needs to be done around education as well around this topic. 65% of respondents believe that their organisations offer flexible work, but they believe that that's just because the organisation is a generous organisation or, you know, living out its values. So it's not necessarily attached to the understanding of their rights and obligations in this area. Just over a quarter of people who don't have flexibility intend to apply for this over the next 12 months. So that's a considerable part of anyone's workforce, and it does show that there's a growing awareness. Interestingly, older workers are more likely than younger employees to be aware of their rights in this area. So yeah, I guess people who have been in organisations for a long time are more sort of considerate of their other needs that they have and are more au fait with what's happening in the legislation. 35% of workers believe that their organisations don't allow for flexibility. Now this is relatively scary because if you believe your organisation doesn't allow it and you are offered a job, an equivalent job somewhere else and they do allow it, you're probably going to jump ship. And we've got a stat that shows how many people would be willing to do that. So if you look at the breakdown of the different age groups, caring for family members is still the biggest reason for flexibility, and Gen Xers are the biggest users of that, that reason for flexibility. So Gen Xers are the people who are sort of sandwiched between the boomers and the Gen Y and, you know, have predominant caring responsibilities in society. For millennials, the reason that they would like flexibility is much more attached to personal hobbies and pursuits. So that really sort of bears out, and we'll hear a little bit more from Kevin about what he's seeing sort of worldwide. But that whole a need to have some work, you know, work in an organisation for some hours of the day, but then also have some other hobbies and also perhaps be involved in another business venture is really sort of playing out there. And for study purposes, it's a little bit lower. So a full 68% of workers said that if they were offered an equivalent role in another organisation, they would jump ship if they could do it flexibly. So that, I think, for us was one of the most sort of profound stats that came out of this all. So there is a real need for people to look at a sustainable work-life balance. And other researchers also indicated that people are even, employees are even willing to be underemployed, but with flexibility, rather than being fully employed without. And what I mean by underemployed is in a role that doesn't fully utilise their skills and that is perhaps less than what they could provide. So that's a really good indication of how important it is. When we asked them what the benefits would be for their organisation if they had flexibility, 71% said a positive impact on employee commitment. So in New Zealand we have a staff turnover rate of between 11 and 18%, and I think many organisations have done the stats around, you know, if we could reduce that by 5%, what would it mean for the bottom line? So employee commitment and engagement is a really important benefit. 67% believe that they would have improved performance and productivity and better discretionary effort. 62% believe that reduced staff turnover would result from introducing flexible work. And 51% believe that the ability to attract key talent would be improved by introducing flexibility. So some of the organisations that we deal with are starting to test this now with their recruitment practices. And it remains to be seen whether that works. So we asked respondents, why wouldn't you apply for flexible work? If you know your organisation offers it and you know that you have a right in terms of legislation, what's stopping you? And the two top reasons were culture of presenteeism So if I'm not in the office, I'm not perceived to be working, and I probably won't be rated in what I deliver. And fear of negative career consequences. So the sting in the tail with regards to flexible work. And when you know, just from a societal perspective, if you think of women applying for flexible work for family reasons, it's relatively acceptable. It probably would result in career retardation, or it might take longer for them to get to the top job, but it's still, you know, from a societal point of view, pretty acceptable. If you think now of men applying for flexibility for that same reason, slightly less acceptable in most organizations, slightly more, it's much newer for organizations. And then if you take it one level down and say, well, what if you applied for flexibility as a woman because you wanted to pursue sporting interests? How would that be perceived in your organization? Would that be career limiting? So there definitely is a sting in the tail, and there's research is starting to be done about the relationship between flexible work or part-time work and performance ratings, and then career progression. So it's a really interesting cycle that plays out. And most of the people that we canvassed really believe that there is a sting in the tail. And so while they have a right to it, would they do it? Possibly not. One of the other reasons is also fear of excessive workload. So you hear often that people go work on a part-time basis but still have a full-time workload. And so the mechanisms are not put in place to actually support that. Often it's viewed as a concession by the manager, and there's not a team-wide approach to it. So maybe colleagues feel like the person is not pulling their weight, or that it's not working for them. So that mistrust, lack of support, 22% people of the respondents feel that that's a real key barrier. From an organizational perspective, when we ask them, well, you know, why doesn't your organization offer this, or why they're not doing anything about this, they believe that many managers are not equipped to have those discussions with their employees, and also that many managers do not understand their rights and obligations in terms of the legislation, and also that they don't understand necessarily what the benefits are from an organizational perspective. So they don't understand, you know, the correlation between flexibility and engagement and discretionary effort, and ultimately productivity. So there's a level of ignorance in organizations around what this actually means, and as a result, managers are not really trained on these issues. So it's an emerging sort of field in terms of training managers around diversity and inclusiveness and flexibility and all of these issues which weren't on the radar 5 to 10 years ago and weren't ever included in management training. So it really needs to evolve a little bit in terms of getting managers to understand. Lack of the understanding of the legislative framework, and then also perception of unfair treatment by other employees. So this is what happens when it's not a systemic approach, when it's an individual approach. So I'm going to allow you flexibility because I think you're a good worker and you deserve it, and I'm not going to allow this person flexibility because I don't think their reason is good enough. Okay, so that kind of approach really creates, it's like a divide and conquer, and it creates a lot of a perception of unfair treatment and a lot of resentment as well. And almost always it doesn't work. So you really have to take a much more strategic approach to flexibility and a much more organizational approach, and also allow teams to create their own framework for how that might work. So they're the guys closest to the work, they're the people who are dealing with your clients, and they understand what it takes to actually create that flexible framework. And we've done some work in organizations where we've taken, for example, a retail organization where we've looked at a whole regional approach with multiple branches. And through a regional approach, we were able to accommodate needs of all the branches because we were able to sort of flex people across the different areas. So sometimes it's difficult to take an individual approach, but an organizational wide approach is much better. Many organizations don't have a formal process to address flexible work applications. So people don't know where to go to take the request. They may not have a close enough relationship with their manager, they may not feel comfortable to talk to them about it, and so it just prevents people from even going there. So in terms of the new legislation, organisations are required to have an auditable process, which is clear to their employees and which can be documented. So it's one of the new requirements that organisations need to look at. So, in summary, and there's a lot more information in the report, but what we're seeing is that the correlation between flexible work and employee engagement can't be ignored. These trends are not going to become less pronounced, they're going to become more pronounced. There's a lot more that we have to think about in terms of the talent picture. Talent is going to become terribly scarce over the next few years, and we really need to think organisationally about how we design work to accommodate the needs of our workers. Organisations really need to get up to speed with regards to their obligations in this area, and the risk of not sharing it and not educating staff is that you may lose those staff to another organisation who is sharing it and who is talking about it. So it's really about keeping your key talent in the organisation. A lot of work needs to be done around that sort of age group, 31 to 45, and if you think about the sort of the potential leadership cohort for tomorrow, how are you going to make it work so that these people will be willing to move into executive positions and leadership roles in your organisation and still maintain their work-life balance? It's going to be a very important group to work with. So this integration of flexible work really is a sustainability issue. In the same way that you would look at your machinery in your organisation or your equipment or whatever it is that you do and make sure that you maintain that to the highest level so you can provide your service. In the same way, people are really the sustainable human resources issue that you have to deal with. And if you don't look at this issue, I think all the research is telling us that you probably will bleed out your key talent from your organisation and find it very difficult to remain competitive. So the question for organisations, we believe, is not should we do this, but really how should we do this? And on that note, it's really about getting the people at the coalface to help you to design what this might look like for them, and not dictating a menu of options for them and trying to get them to choose one. So it really gets down to a much more inclusive leadership style and really talking to your people on the ground and understanding what it is that they need.